Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we will be focusing on Solaris lighting. This will be an actual tutorial where I will be going through everything step by step, trying to problem solve and make things look pretty in an easy and professional manner. Thanks again for your social media engagement on all my socials where I am asking polls, showing future videos. So I really appreciate it, and I would like to move forward with these things. So as usual, let me know in the comments below if you want to have anything improved, if you have any tutorial ideas, anything that will help to increase engagement, that would be highly appreciated. All right, so now we are back in Houdini, and I would say let's get started right away.
You can see I have an empty canvas. I am in the stage, which is Solaris in Houdini. I have my previews on. I changed my layout slightly, but this is essentially what we're dealing with. So the first thing what we obviously need is some geometry to actually light against. So I do have the OD tools, and using the asset library, I have my all my vehicles in here. So I'm using the RenderMan Challenge rolling teapot, and you can quite easily get that from the RenderMan page. And get moving from there. By default, this is pretty big. You can see it's like 100 units almost wide. So let's just scale it down by 10%. And now this is our smaller scale. It's still big, but this will probably do. So this is our base geo. Nothing specific just yet. So we can create a grid as our ground plane. We can just call this maybe ground and make this also bigger. So now we have a 10-meter ground plane, and let's also do some nice camera framing. I will be focusing on the teapot, hitting spacebar and F, zooming in here, something like this. Click on the no camera thing, then select new camera. A new camera will be created. You can check the settings. It's 50 focal length. I always like longer lenses, so let's go 105. And then we can zoom out slightly to get a pretty nice placement. I like to see her face a little bit. The tank is rolling towards camera. We are pretty much on, I don't know, almost ground level, maybe like that. Maybe zoom out a little bit more. And let's just call this our placement. So this is our basic setup for lighting. And now we can dive right into this by me creating our first light source. Let's just go, for the time being, let's just use a Skydome. Or is it an ENV or dome light? There's all different names for this. So let's just create this dome light, hook it up. And by default, this is a white light. So you won't really see much structure on the geometry because the default is white. What I want to do, back to my HDRI library under OD tools, I can switch that to HDRI. And let's go to maybe HDRI Haven. This is at some point I downloaded most of them in here, so we have a big library to choose from, and you can also search. Let's go for night and maybe just use the Blue Lagoon night. So I have my dome light selected, double clicking here. This will pop in the path right away, and now we can see we already get some very straightforward lighting happening. And if I now go to perspective, enable Karma XPU, which runs on my GPU, this is now currently what we get. If you don't want to see the selection of your objects in the viewport or the lights, you can just click here and then you only see the render. At the moment, I have my default background to dark gray. By hitting D, you can bring up this options dialog, and you can just maybe change this for this tutorial to dark because we are trying to emulate some kind of night lighting. And before changing any exposure values, it's important to know what kind of shader you're dealing with. At the moment, it's just a default shader that is coming with Houdini. So to kind of be in a physical ballpark, it's always good to have maybe working with a neutral gray in the beginning. So I'm using the new quick surface material here, and I'm probably using this or placing this after the geo creation. So this is my quick surface material. By default, this is what it comes into. We can just call this base shader, and then we also need to have a material assign, or you can just drag it onto where you need it to be. So it acts as on the mesh or on the component, and I just want to assign this on the component. And the same thing again for the ground plane. I can just drop it onto the ground, and you can see both have now the same shader assigned, and they are also being filled in at the top here. So that is all I wanted. So now back to here. If we enable XPU again, we can now see we have a different shader. The default one is pretty white. It's just all on one. And for neutral gray, we want to be around 0.18 ideally. So you can now see this would be our base color. And with this HDRI, which is a night HDRI, we still feel to be a little bit too bright. So it's quite easy to just reduce the exposure. Exposure is like a quadratic fall off, meaning one negative stop is reducing the light intensity, the luminance value, by half. If you go -2, the luminance value we have now will be reduced by half again. You see it gets, it's for me a quite easy way to put in values. Let's say you're working with intensity and you want to double the intensity, you would just go to 2, but at some point you're really high and then you don't know, okay, what would I do now to double the intensity? Would it now be, 16? Then you go 32, and at some point it's really crazy values. And with exposure values, it's just always one stop is doubling exposure, 2 stops doubling exposure, 3 stops. And I like this. It's for me quite convenient. It comes from photography essentially. -2. Let's say this is our base lighting, and I feel we need to rotate this a little bit. Let's go middle mouse, click and drag on rotate. So now we can see maybe just some subtle backlighting. I think will work wonders for the shot. Maybe this is even too much. I'm just trying to find some cool pinks. Maybe just leave it there for now. And then the color for our dome light, we want to tint it because we just want to say it's a kind of moonlight environment. So go back to base properties. You can obviously now change the saturation. Everything will become red. And then we just switch it to some kind of blue. And then obviously we have to reduce the saturation by quite a bit. Maybe something like that. I know it's quite hard to read, but we can bring up our color correction plus up, and then you can see kind of the saturation values that we're dealing with. This is just a viewport compensation here. Clicking here will get rid of this. All right, so that is the first part, setting up our base rig. And now comes the fun stuff in lighting. Now we will be working with placing actual lights and making things look very interesting. And it's always important for objects to show the shape, show the light, the key light direction, and then add some beauty lights, fill lights, stuff like that. Let me just try to, I think I'm not super happy yet with the placement of this backdrop light. Let's just try to rotate this even less. Okay, now we get less pinks. This is what I wanted. So in order for us to create a moonlight look, we already get this bloom at on the ground level here. But now let's create a distant light. A moon is a distant light. It does not have any much parallax. So by using a distant light, you get parallel lines, and you don't, like for instance a spotlight or area light is very local to your scene, that will produce quite a big perspective. All right, so if you don't have this open, the light tool, but usually this is just with this little cursor enabled, you can either hit enter to open up the manipulator handle, or you can click this button here. Shift F1 shows you the hints or hides them. And I use this tool quite a lot to place my lights, and it's super handy. So what you can do, you can obviously adjust the distance, the brightness, and all of that in here, but you also have these placement modes, specular, diffuse, and shadow. If I change my mode to diffuse and I click here, for instance, this will now illuminate this area here. And if I would increase my exposure, maybe like this, you can now see if I click, everything gets illuminated where I'm clicking. This is now diffuse lighting. And if I want to do a specular placement, this will place the specular highlight where I'm clicking. If I click here on the side, you can see now this is where the specular is. So it's super nice to be very precise to place some specular highlights. Let me change the shader a little bit, make it a little bit more rough. Let's go maybe 0.5, so we get a nicer fall off. So back to the distant light. Let's say we want to have some kind of backlit moon lighting. So we would go to diffuse, saying this is our diffuse area or placement. And we can't go around the edge to do a proper diffuse placement, right? So that's why specular comes in super handy. Potentially you can also say, hey, this is where I want to place my shadow pivot and my shadow point. And now I can say, okay, this is now the length of the shadow or the direction of the shadow. So you can be also very specific. I think this is probably an easier way to place like almost backlit key lights. Right, so this is now my placement. And I really like that it's kind of lifting her head and the silhouette of the teapot. So that's pretty nice. And again, we can play with color. We can make this a little bit blue. Usually, you know, moonlight is white, but in stylized lighting, you will always see a little hint of blue, which is something we can use with color or color temperature. Doesn't matter much. And now this is our first key light. I feel that the ground is probably too illuminated. So we can now, instead of having a base shader for the ground, we can just duplicate this one, call this ground shader. And we could then drag this onto the ground. Not sure why this didn't work. Let's just drag this on the ground here. There we go. Now we got another material assign. And we should now have the ground assigned, and we can now make it even darker, maybe make it a little bit more specky, and then we go darker. Let's say it's a tarmac value, something like that. So now let's look back into our camera. This is our angle, and now let's place some rims, some kick lights. Depends how you want to name them, but I always call them rim or kick lights. So we would just do a regular light like that, look through it, and then we can call this rim, so it's properly named under the light section here. And then let's go for warm. It's always good to have some color in your images. So if you have cool, it's always good to have something warm. So it's called complementary colors, essentially. We can base it off temperature. Let's go maybe for kind of a fire temperature, 3000 Kelvin. And similar as we just did, we can now go to either shadow placement or specular placement. And we can now just click in her face, and we now need to increase exposure as well. You can see we have this adjust light brightness. By default, it's going to change intensity, but if you right click, you can change it to use exposure instead. And now Control Shift, click and drag. You can now see we are boosting exposure, and I really love this. You can also isolate a light by clicking this little solo mode like that. Now this light is just isolated if you want to place things more accurately. And again, we are on the specular placement. And this is now, it depends a little what you want to do. You can also obviously zoom in to the face and be very precise where you want that specular highlight. You can go maybe on here, under her eyes, or on the bridge of the nose. It's really up to you where you want to do it. Or similar as the shadow, you can click where you want to place the pivot and then shift click where you want to see the shadow moving over. So it's quite flexible where you really want to showcase it. So I kind of like this. If you go back to the camera view, you can now see her face is nice and highlighted. And we have pretty strong shadows, but for now, let's just live with this. Disable the solo mode. Now this is our lighting. And now I feel our front is quite dark, so we always like to have some kind of fill lights to make things not super crunchy in the foreground. So let's just Alt click and drag the light to duplicate this, and we just name this fill, and let's make this more neutral. So we just reset the Kelvin, so this is kind of a white color now. And now we go back to our manipulator, make sure we are in diffuse mode, and we just click here to get a diffuse fill. Let's say, yeah, kind of here, I guess. And then we can increase the size of the light as well. At the moment, oh, actually, are we on point lights? Were we on point lights all the time? I guess so. So I didn't actually catch that, weirdly enough. So if we go back to the rim light here and we change it to be a rect light, which I wanted it to be, we now have the controls to adjust the size and the shadow softness. And if you enable normalize power as well, this will give you a constant exposure, which is not affected by the size of the light. Usually, if it's not normalized, the bigger the surface area, the stronger the exposure. So at this moment, this is now just a way for you to control kind of the shadow size if you have normalized power on. So now go back to the fill light. Let's do the same thing. Rect light is what I wanted it to be. And now we can make this really wide. and probably a bit higher, and you can see how bright it gets the bigger I make it. So normalize power on, then we can reduce exposure just to get some fill lights in here. And it's a little bit lit from the side, so I just want to move outside of this view. And yeah, you can also look through lights. I forgot to mention that. You can go to when you have the light selected, look through light. We want to look through the fill light, lock the camera. So now I can freely, first of all, it's always a good habit to just focus on your asset. And now we are kind of locked into this. You can now go back outside by just disconnecting unlocking it. So you have freedom to look in perspective mode. Oops. And now we just want to, now I just want to rotate the light without just with this handle here. So we can just rotate it. There we go. And now if we look back through the shot camera, we can quite easily now increase exposure until we feel we have the fill level that we want to. So pretty straightforward. And this is already now really pulling the image from the background. We see the nice shaping rim light. Rim light is probably overpowering the key light. Usually the key light is the strong light source. At the moment, I think the rim light is a bit too hot. So we can reduce the exposure, maybe like that. So that works a lot better. And now what I wanted to show you is a way to create more interesting shadows. And in the photography or film terms, it's called a gobo. It's essentially something that goes right in front of the lens of a light, and then it creates some nice patterns on it. And to do that, you have this light filter library, this guy here. I can just drop this at the bottom, look through that. And by default, there's nothing going on in here. But if we jump into this, we can now create light filters. And there are a couple of light filters that you can use. For this video, I want to work with the gobo. And all at once essentially is a texture. And if we go to the asset library, I do have a couple of textures that we can utilize under Gobos. This is something I use a lot in lighting to create some kind of softer ground shadows, mimicking some trees or leaves or window panes, all of that stuff. And now I can quite easily just drag it. Let's see, do we want this one? Actually, let's try something. Let's try this guy at the top here. So I'm just dragging it here. So now the Gobo is in here as a JPEG, and we can just open up our panel in case we might need it because it lives inside the VOPs. So we always would need to jump in. And then you can autofill this. It will then fill in the VOPs, the Gobo, and you can assign this to a light. And for this video, I just want to assign this to the rim light. And I just drag that in here. And now you can see something happen to the rim light. If I look through from the side, and also if I change the size of the light itself, smaller size will mean sharper gobo patterns. You can now see, we kind of see that tree texture coming through. And I can now rotate this, and you can see now this is our tree pattern that is kind of projected from the light itself. And we can move it if we want to. You can see we can place it. So if you have a specific light placement, then you can move just the gobo. And we had a specific light placement. So I will just undo the rotations that I just did, but I will reduce the size of the light to get some nice sharp gobo patterns. And you can see in the render right away what is going on here. Okay. So now we can quite easily just offset things as we see fit, make it more interesting, maybe scale it up, make it bigger, move it down slightly. You can play with the density, like how strong is the effect, by playing with the effect value. So this is kind of the intensity of it. And if you now go back to our camera, you can now see it's quite broken up, and it's always best to probably place it looking through the shot camera. But now you can see that the rim light has some really nice look to it, and we can again change the scale. We could potentially even use a texture repetition. So now it's kind of repeating all over. But this is again what you are creatively after. And this will also affect you can also control the light exposure as well. But I'd rather have you do it in here, then it's all at the same place. And we can probably move this a little bit. I don't find a nice position just yet. Yeah, this is cool because we can see the shadows now creeping over, and it's just breaking it up a little bit more. As far as I know, light filters do not work on distant and Skydome lights because they don't have a physical location in space. They are kind of environment lights, so there's no placement. But rim lights, spotlights, all these local lights, those you can use to create the effect you want. And now we can look into a little bit of the comp setups. And actually, before we do that, let's work on the camera. I always like to play with depth of field. I think that is really an interesting thing to make your shots look more interesting. So we do have our shot camera. And if we hit enter on the shot camera, we now have the camera tool enabled, similar as we did with the light tool. You can hit Shift F to display a focus plane. And by just clicking, you can set the focal distance. By default, you won't see much because I think the f-stop is on 0, which means there's no depth of field. But if you increase this, you can now see if I click here, that we see her face is out of focus. And if we make this quite small, you can now see it's really out of focus. Back to the camera, shift clicking. Why does this not work anymore? For some reason, let me try again, Shift F. It's not really setting the focal distance properly anymore. Well, I can just set it manually, I guess. I think the f-stop is probably too small for this to work properly. Yeah, there we go. Now it's working again. And this is a way for you to set the focal distance, and you can also do it manually by just moving things if that works better. Let me just check if everything is in order. Looks good. Yeah, for some reason I can't shift click anymore. Let's see. Toggle f-stop. What does Shift A do? No, we don't want to set f-stop. We want to Shift F, and then we want to set focus distance, shift clicking. It kind of doesn't allow me to click in the background anymore. Anyways, it's not a big deal. We can, as I said, we can set the focal distance ourselves. I'm just trying to find a good value here for her face. I want her face to be in focus. We're getting there. So it's something around this, I think. So we can reduce it to quickly see where our focus is, like that. It's a little bit off, so we can, depends on how accurate you want to do this. And you can also just do region rendering. That will be a lot quicker to quickly, really fast to see where you focusing on. I guess it's a bit small for the screen recording. But anyways, we now have I think a pretty good focal point. You can see the foreground is a little bit out of focus and the background is in focus. We can then enable denoising. So now we have a denoised image. So that is already pretty cool. And we can also make sure that our environment light is enabled in the render. So under dome light, go to the camera tab and then render light geometry, enable that to see actually the background. And it's a nice creamy background because of the depth of field. And again, now we could rotate it until we see something more interesting. So transform, and then let's just rotate it until we see maybe, oh, this is pretty nice. This could be working pretty well. And now another cool thing, the lens, camera lens material, also pretty new. It allows you to quickly create interesting lens effects. And by that I mean you can easily change the bokeh shapes. At the moment it's circular, you can make it polygonal, which should change the shape of the spheres in the background. And we just need to make sure under comma, use lens shaders enabled, and then lens material. We do want to pick it, and it finds this hopefully directly. Did it find it? Comma. Actually, it did not find it. It created a new one on the camera, I feel. Yeah, okay, let's not use that. Let's use the one we just created. It doesn't matter really, but let's just point it to this one instead. This one here. And now you can see we get this hexagonal shapes as our bokeh look. And again, you can change a couple of things here. You can actually plug in your own texture maps. We can try this. I think I do have a couple in the asset library as well. Let's see if we lens kernels. There you go. We do have a couple. So maybe, again, this is a bit tricky to find a good one, but should not be too drastic. I don't know. Let's just pick. I want some kind of, let's use this one. And where is our texture? Oh, sorry, not anisotropy map, bokeh map, texture map, enable. And we want to drag this in here. So now we have a texture map. Let's see if this actually works. Hard to say. It's just blurry, but it could work. I'm not fully sure. but I think it did it. And what I also like to do is then play with lens distortion, because physical lenses always have distortion. They always are bent in a slight manner. You can see now this is obviously asking a lot, but it's a subtle effect, maybe 0.1. So you can see we are just distorting this a little bit. And this is now getting into camera effects and all of that, but it is cool to see a realistic render by doing that. And then you do have aberration, which I like to play as well. It's now in render aberration. So this is actually doing it properly. You can see our bokehs, or bokeh, it depends how you want to call it, is now kind of smearing, and you get these color separations. It's a bit much, I guess. Let's go 4.5. Yeah, I kind of like that. Then you do have vignetting. I like to play with that as well. So it kind of fades out the edges. Depends, again, how much you want to use it. And that is pretty much it. Then you have tilt shift effects, focus mapping effects, shadow shapes, all of that stuff, which you can play with. So there's a lot of things to do. And this is now just lensing stuff, right? So now comes the last part of this, where we can work with cops again. And in previous tutorials, I did show already a couple of things using cops, but now we can deep dive a little bit, go into slap comp, use the slap comp block, which will import our render. We can say use our import camera. So now we are looking into the shot camera and presenting the image. And usual things to do is probably remapping things. I like to do that a bit to get some kind of photo look to an image by just playing with the curves here. And you can see if I move it up, let's view from it, we can kind of change the gamma or whatever you want to do. And this is something I do in Photoshop as well. I always click here and here, and then I'll lift the blacks. You can now see only the blacks. It's essentially a toe function. We're just lifting the blacks a little bit and then adding a little bit of curve back in. This just creates a little bit of a lift. And I like that. It's like a Kodak filter or something like that, which I always like to adjust. And then you've got gray nodes. This is OFX third-party plugin support. I always like to add some grain to the images. This just helps to create some, again, film look. And then you just connect that in here, look through it, and then you will see we get the grain pattern. Default is quite big, so you can just play with your frequency, make it really small, or depending obviously on your resolution, your numbers will be different. Then play with the amplitude, reduce that a little bit, and just bring in a subtle hinge of this color. And then, again, we can play with vignetting. I did that already in camera, but if you feel you need more, you can obviously do that by dropping that in. We can then adjust it by looking through it. This is now the radius. We can play it up, but again, up to you. And this is kind of a simple comp thing. And the cool thing now is if we look through the end of the comp, we can go back to our stage. This is now our render, but then we can just click that little button and we get our comp treatment on top as well. So I really like this approach of working because you see everything kind of as a final result. I can obviously change everything. I can, for instance, change the dome light rotation. Let's see, maybe a more interesting backdrop. It's all pretty much the same, I guess. These hot lights, maybe a warm is nice. And then we can also, I don't know, adjust the moonlight. First look at the comp, maybe. This is what the comp looks. We do have a clamp, which I just noticed. So if we jump back in quick, the remap is clamping. So we want actually extending it. So we get our highlights back. And then, as I said, let's say we want to adjust the distant light. We can quite easily use our tool again, clicking here. And it's always, you can see my cursor is kind of jumping. This is because it's rendering and displaying the comp at the same time. So I always like to just disable it for setting things. And let's say we want to place it specular now for, is it the right light? Let's just make sure we are on the distant light here. Yeah, I guess it is. And then we can just quite easily just place it where we want it to go, or place it like a diffuse light as we showed before. I know something is now not working as expected, but either way, let's actually check the transforms. Let's just reset everything. Let's try this again. Maybe this now works. I'm not sure what I did now. And using the specular mode, we can now quite easily adjust this. Go back to our calmer lens material and then see the end result right away if we enable the comp. This is then the expected result with the comp enabled. So to me, this feels really intuitive to very quickly get a cool looking result. And if you don't want to use all of the fancy night lighting, for example, you can quite easily do a switch. Let's say we move this to the side, we do a switch like this, and we now switch to input 1. So we're on this stream, and we do like a physical calm of physical sky, and we can then change it to the new atmospheric mode, and then we can also go back to XPU, look through a shot camera, and then play up the exposure, and then we can, as usual, play with the height, so we kind of have a sunsetty look or feel to it. Let's go a little bit lower like that, and then we can rotate this from the front or whatever. So you get I think you get the idea. It's fairly quick to get some really nice lighting going on. Let's boost the exposure, and maybe we want to add like a strong kick light here as well. We can now just go into light, make sure that it is a rect light. By default, it's a point light. And then we can quite easily select this, use again our fancy little tools, Shift F1. We can place the specular on the side here, bring up exposure to 10 maybe, make the light taller like that. We can move it away as well by clicking. I thought we could move it like that, but there's also a distance mode, control click and dragging to move it back. And then let's say we make this more bluish, increase saturation. Let's go like that. And then we obviously will reduce the exposure to just get a hint of this blue. That kind of mimics maybe the setting, like the dusk sky already. So it's very quick to change setups. And again, looking at the comp now, this is then our comp result with the little of a toe effect. And then if you feel like switching it up again, we can quite easily go back to input 0, and we have our quick night lighting setup. And honestly, I don't like the front light, so we can go back to specular placement on our distant light, and we can just maybe click here to move it back here. I think this is nicer to have this contrast. And then, yeah, I would say we can call it a day. Pretty nice introduction, I feel. Do let me know if you have any questions, if I need to go into things in more detail. Obviously, I am not showing the render step, but I covered that in several other tutorials. Yeah, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this one.